Thank you so much for joining us today in the first of our series on the narratives of failure and vulnerability on the road to hope. It is my distinct pleasure and my co-host, Dr. Pat Merritt-Nipissing, to introduce to you today somebody who needs no introduction in the field of teaching and learning in higher education in Canada and beyond, Dr. Joy Mighty. Dr. Joy Mighty retired from Carleton University at the distinguished rank of Professor Emerita. She had served at Carleton as the Associate Vice President, Teaching and Learning, and later as a Senior Scholar for Innovation in the Teaching and Learning Office of the Provost and Vice President Academic. Prior to her work, Dr. Mighty was the director of the Center for Teaching and Learning at Queen's University. And before moving to Kingston, she was leading the conversations of teaching and learning as the director of the TLC Center and professor of business administration at the University of New Brunswick. Dr. Mighty is mighty in all senses of the word. Her interests are diverse and eclectic, but also aligned in some pretty fundamental values that are hopeful around the purpose of quality higher education. She works on organizational development and change with a real emphasis and focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion. She has consulted for universities, private sector, not-for-profits all around the world, in Canada and the Caribbean, China, England, Germany, Japan, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, and the United States, to name a few. That was when we could travel. Now she does this online and shares her tremendous wealth of expertise and insight with so many people who benefit from these conversations. She recently was the recipient of the Christopher Napper Lifetime Achievement Award through STLHE, the Society of Teaching and Learning in Higher Education. And she joins us today to talk about failure and vulnerability and hope in her own experiences on her trajectory as one of the most transformative leaders in higher education in Canada, but also as a colleague, friend, and mentor to so many. Joy, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're most welcome. Thank you for inviting me to be with you.
Well, you were the first person on my list when Pat and I first conceived of this series, and we were talking about the ways in which the people that we love and most look up to are ones who are transparent and open about their vulnerabilities and failures. And thinking about those transformative voices for me in my own journey, I said, I want Joy. And so you are our first interviewee in this series, and it's just it's a true joy. And so I think we're gonna start with a open question, one that doesn't have a lot of structure to it, and you can choose to interpret in any way you feel it resonates for you. But can you tell us your story? How did you get here?
Wow, now how much time do you have?
Yeah.
My parents would tell you, do not give me an open forum to talk, because I've not stopped. They claim in my family that I was born teaching. I started teaching at the age of 3, when the furniture in the house, the cushions, the chairs were my students. I'm not even sure where I got the concept of school from. I do have an older brother and sister, so they were going to school, and I think that their daily journey to school resonated with me. In fact, I used to run down the road behind them, wanted to go to school. So I actually started, they put me in school at 3 because they couldn't keep me tamed, right? And from the get-go, I loved the whole idea of schooling and education, and that has had an enormous continuing impact on me. So I think from the beginning, I always wanted to be a teacher. There was only one time in my life when I was about 10 or so that I said, oh, maybe I'll be a radio announcer. But it didn't last very long. That fad didn't last very long. It was because I saw one of my prefects at school who was a prefect who had become a radio announcer. a very successful one at that. So I thought, oh, that I could do. I could talk, which is what radio announcers do, right? But teaching, I think we said you could talk more. Although you shouldn't. You should allow your students to talk. So that's how my love of teaching began. Um, I I went to one of the best. I was born, as you know, in Georgetown, Guyana, and I went to the best. It was the best girls' school based on the British system in Guyana, and so you got the best education. And from there, it was a question of just moving through the ranks, as with academia, going to do your O levels, your A levels. It was like a matter of, you know, process. You just did it. And I went to the University of the West Indies. And my University of West Indies at the Mona campus in Jamaica. And there I studied English, which was my love. Actually, French was my first love. But because, and of course, this is because my brother and sister used to come home and talk about la table. And, they would label things in the house. And I thought, oh, that sounds good. But it didn't hold me long enough because the English has a story behind it. It wasn't just labeling things, it was a story and people. And so I did English and never regretted it for a moment. I did this in Jamaica at the University of the West Indies, and I then went on to do my official professional qualification for being a teacher in, I guess, the British system. So I did my diploma in education, so I was now a teacher. Don't mess with me. I had the label, right? And there was, so I continued, teaching. I taught that I was married to a Jamaican who was from Montego Bay. So I taught at Cornwall College, a high school in Montego Bay for boys, where he had attended. And I got this invitation, shall we say, to join a group of pioneers. We call ourselves pioneers, who were beginning a new teachers' college. I think it was funding from the World Bank and the government of Jamaica that started this new teachers' college in the western end of Jamaica, where there was no previous teachers' college. We used to say teachers' training college at one stage, but teachers' college. And there were 7 of us who began that college, and it was one of the most impactful moments of my life. It was exactly what I wanted to do, to be innovative, to be creative, to interact with other people who love teaching. So the 7 of us started off with a blank slate. We didn't have a particular tradition to follow. We were told, do what you want. So can you imagine the excitement? A blank slate, do what you want, to start a new college. And that's when we sort of thought about, who do we want to see as teachers in our schools? And so we came up with a 4-pronged approach that became the philosophy of the school, of the college. So students had to satisfy us on academic development, professional development, personal development, and community development before they could graduate. And we took that very seriously, and the students soon learned to take it very seriously. And that was, I didn't know it at the time, because I'd never heard of Boyer. Well, that was before Boyer even wrote his stuff. But that's the kind of thing that Ernest Boyer talks about, the integration and the scholarship of teaching and learning and application and discovery. It was so profound that we were saying to these students, you have to be a whole person to be able to be in charge of our youth. And that was one of the most rewarding aspects of my life at Sam Sarah Peters College. I actually was, so even the way we ran the college, we had what was called a central management committee. So instead of we did have a principal, the central management committee was chaired by the principal, but this central management committee would be like your faculty council, I guess, or, but it was very central to making decisions about how the school would develop. And the Central Management Committee was made up of the chairs of the committees of each of those areas: Professional Development Committee, Personal Development Committee, Academic Development Committee, and Community Development Committee. And I was the chair of the Community Development Committee. And again, I think that's where my understanding of the importance of community and engaging with the community began. So many years later, I moved on to do a master's, a Master of Arts in Education, again at UWI in Mona. And after that, I felt, all my colleagues, all my friends who went to school with me are earning big fat dollars, not teaching. I need to leave teaching and earn big fat dollars. So I went into the private sector. I went to Jamaican National Building Society, which is like your savings and loan financial institution. And I was the training officer. So I was responsible for establishing a training department. And we did, in those days, we called it a manpower inventory. You wouldn't say manpower delay, but, an assessment of how people saw themselves in the organization, where they wanted to be the next few years, and how they wanted to get there, what sort of training and development they saw themselves undertaking in order to get there. So that was, again, like education, but not quite education. I liked what I was doing, but I missed the classroom terribly. I pined for the classroom. And so after 3 years, I said, this is not for me. The big bucks don't make a difference in my satisfaction, my comfort level, and so on. So I quit. But what I learned from being in the private sector, people see, oh, you're in business. I'm a financial institution. They think I know about money. I don't. I'm awful. Right? So I always tell people I'm not in the money side of business. I'm in the people side of business. And that was one of the things I learned about being in the private sector. The importance of the people. And because I was doing the manpower inventory, I had an opportunity to meet with every single employee and to talk with them and find out who they were, where they are, what they're coming from, where they're going. So that led me to my choice of doing an MBA, Master's in Business Administration, in business, and led me to focus on organizational behavior, which subsequently became the subject that I did my PhD in, organizational behavior. And because of my particular circumstances, and I'll talk about those in a moment, organizational behavior became more than just how people treat each other or respond to each other or behave in the workplace, but also how equitable the workplace was in terms of treating people. So that was my focus. And I say because of my circumstance, because when I lived, where I was born in Guyana, I lived in Jamaica, I was a member of a majority group. I didn't know what it was to be a minority, honestly. Even in terms of gender, because in teaching, who are the majority? Women, right? So I didn't know, but when I moved to North America, when I moved first to Howard University in Washington, D.C., and the whole American environment and context, and then to York University, where I did my PhD, I learned what it was like to be disregarded because of who you are, and to be just I learned what it was like for people to assume that you didn't know anything, you didn't have anything to contribute because of your social identity, and that got me mad. But and I think it energized me to do work in equity, as you mentioned, Jessica, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Of course, at the time we didn't have those words for it. When I began my PhD, I think it was the Jackson report in the US had just come out about diversity in the workplace. And diversity was the term that was being used. But the other, equity and inclusion, and you could have diversity without having equity and inclusion, right? Those were not so well known at the time. But in the context of Canada, the Employment Equity Act had just been officially legislated, passed in the legislature. And so the equity business was beginning to creep into the discourse. And so I focused in my dissertation, I focused on employment equity in the school system. So I looked, and I focused, of course, narrowly in Ontario. I looked at school boards. What were they doing? And how were they understanding and interpreting the Employment Equity Act? The government of Ontario, at the time it was the Bob Rae government, had provided a number of incentives for people to, employment equity incentives. If you had an employment equity program, you get how many thousands of dollars in your school board. And so my essential question was, who adopts the Employment Equity Act and why? Was it because they were being, because it was being institutionalized in a number of ways, either through mimetic forces, they were copying what they thought were examples of good school boarding or whatever you might call it? Or was it because of coercive forces, because the law was forcing them to do it? So that was one theory that I looked at. Was it institutionalization that was prompting people to adopt employment equity? Or, on the other hand, was it strategic choice? Did people choose to do so because it resonated with their philosophy of education, or their strategy about how students learn and that sort of thing? Of course, we know which side won. The institutionalization was definitely the thing that was driving the adoption of employment equity, as was evidenced by the fact that as soon as the incentives were taken away, people dropped the Employment Equity Act like hot potatoes. It was something that they did because they were forced to do it or because they could get something out of it. But those who stuck with it were the ones who saw it as a deliberate choice. And so that was essentially my thesis, looking at why do people adopt employment equity? And then from there, I guess I did my PhD. I went to, as you mentioned, Jessica, the University of New Brunswick, where I won the first ever teaching award in the Faculty of Administration. And you know how administrators think that if you win a teaching award, you must be could run the center. So so they take you they take you away from teaching and say, you run the center, you're good at teaching. Well, I didn't want to give up teaching, so I ended up having these two jobs, two offices, a lot of work, killing myself, but loving it to death. And I think that's when I joined the Society for Teaching and Learning in Higher Education, because as a young professor, I hadn't previously heard about it. But once I started doing that educational development role, I learned about it, and I became involved. And then the rest is history. From there, I went to Queens, and then from Queens to Carleton, and so on. So that's, I told you, be careful what you ask me. That was a long story.
But it was a fantastic story, Joy.
I just took 2 pages of notes.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Pat, do you want to try to ask a question? Because I have like 15 here.
Okay, you have 50. I'm going to ask one really simple one. And this is the follow-up of, I mean, there was the fantastic upbringing that led you to become a teacher, right? And then there was the master's and PhD that really examined the school board system. And I'm just, for me, I'm always curious, you know, when somebody jumps into administration or educational leadership or things like that, like, what are some of the lessons that you think, you know, came from the early time as a 3-year-old teacher, or maybe a slightly older teacher, that led you to, you know, the leadership positions or the administration positions within education?
Well, that's a really good question. I suppose I always understood teaching to be leadership. I always understood that the person who was teaching was leading. But my concept of leadership always involved others. It was never a solitary endeavor. There were always committees and teams, and you know, I always brought people into that idea of leading.
Right.
So I think that educational development for me involves the whole idea of not just developing teachers, but of teaching.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Totally. Thanks, Joy.
It's beautiful. And it ties to the question that I have so many, but one of the questions I have is tied to your experience creating as 7 founders, a brand new institution with a blank slate, with carte blanche, to be able to understand everything from funding to governance, to what you teach, to how you teach, to how you assess. You created what I'm sort of thinking about right now, which is, how do we design Hope University? How do we design systems to be resilient so individuals don't have to be? How do we reimagine the systems which aren't working? They're broken. They're either broken or they're 19th century systems in a 21st century context, and they're radically obsolete. But how did you, in your thinking about the academic, professional, and personal and community spheres, like living that whole self, do you see hope for creating Hope University in our own 21st century context? Can we do that with our own institutions now? And if so, where do we start?
Woo. You come with the big guns.
Yeah, that's a zinger right there.
Well, I am essentially a hopeful person. It's not by accident that my name is Joy. I have other names. Joy is my third name. I'm Enid Adrian Joy. My first name was Enid, so that was my mother's name and my great aunt's name. the one I mentioned earlier. I was born on her birthday, so I couldn't escape the name Enid. But then you couldn't have three Enids in the family, so they didn't call me that, even though it was official. My paternal grandmother had some French background in her heritage, and she wanted a French name, so Adeline became it. But my father and mother named me Joy because the day before I was born, my father had been promoted to a senior position in the public service. And so it was a joyful moment, a double joyful moment for them. And I think that my life has been, oh, I'm getting emotional, sorry. My life has been a demonstration of that joy, of that hope that things will be good, will be better. Now, it's not just fantasy. There's some real reasons why I think, that hope is in our future. When I see, for example, the outswelling of protests against the horrific murder of George Floyd in the US in 2020, when I see it wasn't just in Minneapolis, it was all over the US, Canada, all over the world. And that gave me a lot of hope because it told me that people understood what it was to be seen. And so hope is, I don't know how religious you are, but I think somewhere in the Bible, there's some talk about, hope and faith being things, what's it called? I'm going to misquote. So people who are hearing this, don't use me out. But it's about hope, hoping for the things that are unseen. So we don't know what it looks like, but we know what it feels like. That's what Maya Angelou talks about. She says, you may not always remember what people said or what people did, but you will always remember how they made you feel. And I think that therein lies our hope for the future. We have not just young people, but even, some professors who had never given this another thought were aroused by what they saw and started to question how they could do things differently. So for me, I will always be hopeful that we can do things better, that we can make people feel better, and that making them feel better will motivate them to do better. I know sometimes it doesn't look very hopeful. And, when I don't know what side of the argument you're down on, but I can tell you that living in Ottawa, I absolutely hated the truckers' protest and what it did to the city and to the people and how it made them feel and that sort of thing. And I'm saying to myself, what are you getting out of this? Because when you make others feel good, you feel good. It's a reciprocal process. I'm going to refer to my favorite African philosophy, Ubuntu. I absolutely love it. And it talks about I am because we are, and because we are, therefore I am. And what it says is that we are so interconnected as human beings that we cannot be human without the other. It's our relationship with the other that makes us human. So in designing new systems and processes and that sort of thing, we have to have at the center people. We've got to have at the center, how are we going to make people feel good about themselves so that they want to, they're energized to do good for all of us. And they've got to see that they are connected.
It's so powerful, Joy. And you gave this talk on Ubuntu, I guess in 2020 now, to the Maple League Consortium of Universities. And it was a hugely attended talk. And we were very early on in the days of this global pandemic and the ways in which we were navigating COVID and all of its complexity. And I just remember, and there are so many reports in the last 2 years of people coming back and saying, when Dr. Mighty talked about this, and when she quoted, the Archbishop Desmond Tutu about the ways in which my humanity is bound up in your humanity, and we can only be humans together, and that it isn't just and talking about reverberating as fundamental values for you, that it can't just be the intellectual and physical dimensions of our humanity. It has to be the emotional and spiritual. Well, it has to be our whole selves, and not just our whole selves as individuals seeking out our own happiness or our own pursuit of a contemplative life or whatever you understand as the purpose, but it has to be inextricably combined and integrated and aligned with our entire ecosystem of local communities, but also global. And I feel like our universities don't do a great job of inviting the emotional and the spiritual in to the intellectual. We don't even do a great job of the physical. We kind of focus just on a very narrow part of our human existence, or we have had a history of doing that. How do we get back to a more integrated sense of self and community, and harness the Ubuntu in order to understand our absolutely inextricable bounding up with one another?
That's a good question. I think that we've got to make it an integral part of the process of education, as we did at Sam Sharp Teachers College. And incidentally, Sam Sharp was the name of a slave who had led a rebellion in Jamaica. So the college was named after him because he was from that part of the world. Right? So that was a very important piece of history that we drew on. This man sought his liberty for us. How are we going to share that liberty? But as an example, when I was the chair of the Community Development Committee, and what we did, when the college started, the physical premises were not completed. Excuse me. And we said to the students, this is your home. You're going to help to finish it. So we brought them in. It was a residential college. And the day when they came, and I remember very, very vividly, the college was on a hill. And the road to the hill was not paved. And cars were rolling back down and having to push each other up. And so they saw the necessity for working on something that was going to be part of their life for the next X number of years. So we began with that community, and that working together on something that benefited the whole of that community began to help them to see that it's not just this community up here on this hill, but that community down there where the poor people live. And so our Community Development Committee did things like we had a library story hour every Saturday, where we had children who had never had books, come to the library. And we went down to them, by the way, and had the library in like a community center. There wasn't a library. And, they read books, they saw books, And then eventually they were able to borrow books and take home. And we did things like reach out to the community and ask, who are your seniors? Do they need their hair combing? What personal needs do they have that we can help with? Some of them who were blind or almost blind loved that we were able to read the Bible to them, because that was a very, very, Christian community. But the students themselves began to see that it wasn't just about them and their comfort going up a hill, but that at the bottom of that hill were the people who helped them to get there, because they were coming from, homes and so on were similar to those kinds of homes. We did, once a year, we did something called a lunch sacrifice. Because it was a residential college, the meals were served and so on. And once a year, we sacrificed our own lunch, and we brought up people from the community in buses and so on, brought them up, and we served them, sat them down at these tables, and we served them. This includes everybody, the kitchen staff, everybody. We served these people. And I've seen people cry because they were being seen. But that could not have happened if it had not been an integral part of the structure of the university, the system. So when we are designing our Hope University, we have to think carefully about what structures and what systems are we going to put in place that will generate hope. It doesn't happen on its own. We've got to be conscious about it.
And I love that metaphor, Joy, of literally they paved the road to the college, not just to get there, but also to get back down into the community as servant leaders, as service and engaged community members, and of fulfilling the moral contract that we have in higher education, which is to a broader society. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
And I think one of the pieces here too, when we were just talking about like the physical and the spiritual and the emotional, like it's that higher education in general, but higher education leaders in particular, right, don't necessarily want to talk about that because of the level of vulnerability, right? Like I'm vulnerable if I step out of my, clearly it's the academic sphere, or clearly it's the economic sphere, all the sort of touchy-feely, huggy, whatever, that level of vulnerability doesn't want to get touched by an administrative body.
Right. Yeah. But we've got to do it. We've got to do it, or else if administrators don't demonstrate their belief in that, there will always be, that talking about that institutionalization and strategic choice again, there will always be people who do it because you told me to do it. But if you stop telling me to do it, I'm not going to do it. So you've got to get them seeing that it's part of who they are, part of who we are.
So thinking about that, Joy, and combining your research at York around people who make decisions and integrate these policies because they're values-based versus they get value out of it because it's incentivized.
Yeah.
And combining that with community engagement where people feel seen and valued and visible and invited into the conversation, do we have to have, and this is, this is a question I already have a feeling about, is a conversation about how we evaluate, review, and promote the professoriate and how we assess the performance of our educational leaders?
Absolutely. I'm glad that you asked this, because it was not until that I think it was, I can't remember what year it was, but I went to an STLHE conference where there was this woman who was from California, a professor, who talking about what we're doing community-wide. She said, why is it that our packages for tenure and promotion have just the academic and the professional perhaps? Why don't we incorporate this other part of our lives? And it dawned on me that I had never, going through the ranks, included any of that stuff. And yet it was what made me me. So, and in submitting my my documents for promotion to full, I call it, I came out of the metaphorical closet in saying, this is who I am. You like it or you don't. But that was an important part of getting the evaluators to see that those research papers don't happen in a void. Those great teaching scores or whatever from students don't happen in a void. There's something else that's going on. For me, it was that human connection. And I thought, why do I keep the human aspect of my teaching, of my education separate when I'm going up for tenure or whatever? And so I said, enough. And since then, I think other people have started, including the personal and the,
yeah,
the community.
The sort of the humanizing aspects of our lives that may be family. It may be, I work in a big team and I don't do this alone, right? I'm not the publication says this, but it's a team effort. Or I love I can't remember where he was from. There was an academic in the US who started their failure CV, right? Which was look, I've gone up, I've won these grants, sure, but there's 27 others that I didn't get through the door on. And I just thought that was a fantastic idea to say, it's a holistic ball, not just the little things that we cherry pick off that right. Somebody thinks are important.
Somebody. And who's the somebody? Right.
Yeah.
But it should be important for us. When it becomes important for us, we make it important to others. Yeah. We tell others, this is an important part of who I am. You take it or you leave it.
Joy, can you talk to us about the risk or vulnerability of doing that and how we can create those spaces? Because, there's, and I think it's really important for our stars like you who can go in and say, take it or leave it and love me or leave me. This is who I am. But we know in our teaching score research, we know in our evaluation, promotion, review, we know even in the hiring process that we have systems and structures that are structurally racist and inequitable. And that when we ask people who are already from historically excluded groups or have had a kind of intersectionality that has not been conducive to being vulnerable because there's too much risk, how do we build systems so that they can be brave and safe at the same time? How do we create hospitable spaces where, the very, privileged amongst us can do that, but also recognize how to make spaces for our more sort of vulnerable humans to engage in that as well?
Ooh, if I knew the answer to that, I'd submit it. Right? I know. But I think it comes back down to who is the leader. Who do we choose as our leaders? And what qualities do we look for in our leaders? And do we make it clear to our leaders, this is who we want as leaders? Forgive me for going back to my family and, family, you probably realize by now is like a really important part of me. My father he was a civil servant. He was what you call a deputy minister here, but in the British system, it's called permanent secretary, right? So he was a permanent secretary. And of course, if the ministry he was in is education, heaven help us. Because all the teachers say, does your father know that you're doing this? Or and if they knew my father, they know he would say, if that's what you want to do, that's what you feel, if you feel strong about it, do it. But when the Guyana government was, during the struggle for independence, they went on the trade unions went on we call it the 90-day strike, because it was 90 days, there was a general strike. Everything was shut down. Gas stations, everybody was on strike, except my father. My father said, I am a public servant. I have my work to do to serve the people, and I'm going to work. So because everything was shut down, I remember gas stations because there was no gas for the car, and he had to ride a bicycle to work. And people would come to our house and picket and protest, like those truckers, with signs and singing, "We shall overcome," and blah, blah. And my father would very calmly, we were excited as kids. Okay, we were like, they're coming. And we were up, there was a veranda upstairs, we were in the veranda, we weren't allowed to go downstairs. And we would be jumping up and excited by it. My father would calmly come downstairs, sit at the breakfast table, have his breakfast. People are outside singing, "We shall overcome and we shall not be moved," and whatever. He just ignored them. When he was done and he cleaned up and stuff, there was no space for him to roll his bicycle through the crowd. So he raised the bicycle over his head and walked through the crowd very politely. "Good morning, good morning, excuse me," and he went, and they parted as he went through, right? And he was one of the few people who subsequently, the government changed, we got independence and blah, blah. And I remember the prime minister calling him, or the president was he at the time, wanted to know how he voted in the last election. My father said, as far as I know, elections are still by secret ballot. So that's between me and my maker. He was scared of no one. And he stood up for things that he believed in. We as children, we paid the price for that. My brother, who saw himself as a sweet boy, as we would call it back in Guyana, ladies' man and blah, blah, always at a party and always having parties at our house and so on. My brother got arrested one night. I can't remember what it was for. And he called my father. And my father said, so, because as far as he was concerned, his role was not to interfere with the process of the law. So my brother spent the night in jail. It was my father said he will learn. And my father also had three brothers actually, who were police officers. And it was they who, did the usual thing and went behind the back and talked and got my brother out of jail. But my brother never got in trouble with the law again. All this to say, my father had a deep commitment to integrity. And as a leader, he subsequently took early retirement from the civil service and went back to school, to college, and studied to become a priest, an Anglican priest, and became archdeacon and everything else. But everybody who talks about him talks about that integrity, how he stood up for what he believed in. And lots of people kept saying, we need more people like him in leadership positions who will establish that these are important principles to live by. But what happened, in fact, my father was the only permanent secretary who retired without being fired. You know, everybody else was thrown out, and, you know, the political systems in these places can be very traumatic. And my father was the only person who left on his own steam. And his enemies and friends alike respected that integrity. So my saying, take it or leave it, was something I learned from my father, that you stand up for what you believe in if you really believe in it. And you show how your belief resonates with who you are and who you would like us to be as a community.
So you're the new president of Hope University. I'm pulling you out of retirement, Joy.
Joy University.
That's fundamental, right? Those deep in the integrity, to be able to be values-based, to be absolutely consistent, to be absolutely transparent, and to anchor integrity in practice in every single, not even every single day, but every single gesture. With your father saying good morning as he held his bike over his head is just the most beautiful image of that, anchoring those values in practice in every way he navigates the world. Yeah.
And it's just so critical to see, right? It's so important to see when we're in such an uncertain time, right? We've got a global pandemic. We've got the mess that was in Ottawa, right? We've got Ukraine. We've got George Floyd. We've almost forgotten that there were Indigenous groups blockading train tracks just before the pandemic happened, right? So we're in these constantly uncertain times, but integrity will lead us through, right? Integrity will situate the administrator or the educator in the classroom or the student, But
it begins with having that leadership that will say to people, this is who we are.
Yeah.
And have people believe him or her.
Yeah.
Can I ask, Joy, because you are Joy impersonated, and I always make the joke that you live up to both of your names. You are Joy and Mighty in that joy, in that hope, as a beacon of integrity for so many of us across Canada and around the world. I wonder when and if do you despair, and what do you do with that despair? How do you harness that because as a change maker, I'm sure you've come up against so many brick walls and so many challenges and so many people not sharing the same values-based or integrity-based approach. What happens when you come across that? And then how do you get back to joy and get back to hope?
Wow, that's a good question. I don't despair much in spite of what's happening around me.
Yeah.
But when things happen, and I tell you, when I went to UNB, because of my past experience at the college and my education background and blah, 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 I was given credit for my teaching. And so I was allowed to go up early for promotion to associate. Now, a promotion to associate is usually tied to tenure, granting of tenure. But I was allowed to go up early for promotion to associate, even though they're exactly the same criteria that are used. So I went up for associate and went through with flying colors. Everybody was, oh, this is great. This is like after 3 years of being there, and wonderful. Ooh. So when I went 2 years later, when my time for tenure went up, all of a sudden these same criteria, which had been enhanced since associate, going up as associate, were not good enough. And I was told I got what's called a tentative negative. And that could have been, that may have been my lowest point as an academic. because it never occurred to me I'd been successful all my life and all the various steps along the way. That somebody could say, no, this is not good enough. And everybody was as shocked as I was. I mean, the union, the faculty association, had a meeting with the HR VP, and they were like, this is good, because again, context. Remember, I am the only Black female professor at UNB. From the time I went there, when I left there, still the only Black female. So they were afraid that I was going to call it racism, and that we would get off on that. And so they met and they wanted, how do we fix this? What are we going to do? And of course, usually you compare, the assessment committees are supposed to compare, like, other people going up for tenure, even in other fields. And I was way out in front in terms of, my accomplishments. So they had a problem on their hands. But I thought, I am not going to allow this to happen. They are obviously not looking at all the evidence. So I put pen to paper, well, figuratively. And I wrote a response to the tentative negative. Before submitting it, I submitted it to the union for them. They say, do you want to come work with us? Because, this captured all the stuff that, we would have, this is great. But I mean, there was no specific thing that you could respond to. It was just a set of racist idiots. That's what it was. The VP, the HR VP, and the union chair, union president saw it as that. This is racism. But I did not once mention racism in my response. So my response to how do you get over despair? First of all, you pick yourself up and dust yourself off. You don't allow it to overcome you. But you also, what I did in that case, I was like a lawyer going through every single thing that I could and responding and giving, and I wrote I don't even know if I still have it. It was a really, really good letter, if I say so myself, that they could not, there's no way you could respond to that without showing your true colors. And it was very respectful. Again, my father's lessons, the good morning and hello and so on, very respectful. But while inside I was, burning up with anger, the anger never came across on the paper. And to me, how you overcome despair is with providing the evidence, providing the proof, the evidence. So if you didn't get it the first time, let me show you how it is. And I will lay it out for you. Here's the evidence.
So sort of moving, with that notion of anger, right, and rage at some things that have happened. If we look at teaching and learning right now in Canada or across the globe, what is the joy that keeps you up at night? What is that thing that you're like shake your fist at, or gives you that sense of anger? Or the flip side is, what is the thing that gets you out of bed all joyful in the morning, right? Teaching and learning in higher ed is so wonderful.
Oh, I don't know. I guess it comes back down to that sense of hope. We're not a lost cause. We're not a lost people. There are enough people who, they don't have to believe exactly what I believe, but there are enough people who believe that that there's hope for a more hopeful, a more enjoyable, a more productive future. That I feel that we have to allow people, we have to give people the opportunity to demonstrate that. Because sometimes, and again, this comes back to leadership. You know, at Sam Sharp, even though there were 7 of us who started that college, teachers college, we involved the students every step of the way. And that was critical. Because again, how you made them feel, they felt important. They felt valued. I mean, even as I was thinking of Sam Sharp Teachers College, I even think of we allow them to conduct their own services, their own, church services, if you like, on Sunday and whatever. And they would always choose this one hymn that became the Sam Sharp National Anthem. And, we had a discussion about this and said, they should be exposing themselves to others. And we said, no, this is what resonates with them. And when you look at the words of that, it's almost like a call. The voice of God is calling my whatever onto him. And it's almost like a vocation, the old sense of vocation. And they believed that they were called. And so we allowed them to adopt that as their quote unquote national anthem. And it was sung every time we had any event. I used to know the words, I don't anymore, but
Well, I love that there is a vocation, there is an invocation, there is a call to a higher purpose or a calling to something larger than ourselves that is communal, that might be invisible, but it is still there. And in fact, even more powerful than the things that we can see. And I think you've just done such a tremendous vocation in higher ed in Canada. And I think the final question I have before we open it up to if you have any questions to us is, in your vocation, in your earliest calling at the age of 3, when you were a teacher, what did you teach?
I can't remember what I taught. I just remember that I said no a lot. No, wrong. And I beat the daylight. Beating is allowed in schools and everywhere else, at least it was in Guyana back then. So I beat the daylights out of the cushion. Wrong, you. And I was a very autocratic teacher at that time.
But we reproduce the systems that we know. So
Right.
We all have to unlearn those systems that we internalize and go through that process of unlearning and unhooking of ourselves in order to learn and to transform. So you are a rehabilitated educator.
Right. right. And funnily enough, the rehabilitation didn't come from the field of education. I mean, alone. It did come from there, but it also came from, my personal life, my family, there are other things that contribute to your understanding of life that goes beyond the textbook model of an educator.
Yeah.
So Joy, do you have any questions for us in this conversation?
Oh boy. I didn't think ahead of time about questions, but what I guess my question is, do you really want to have a Hope University?
So this is the project that has sort of come into focus for me over the last 2 years. And it has come through the sort of process of despair. It's come through the process of challenge, and it's come through the process of a kind of calling, where I do think that our systems are 19th century systems trapped in 21st century context. I think that our systems are systemically and structurally racist, exclusive, hierarchical, and the old ways of being are no longer going to help us create and transform our 21st century context. I think that we have to be hopeful, and we have to challenge the actual in the name of the possible. And we can't just have, I do this all the time, Joy. So I need to ask you more about creating the Sam Sharp College, because I hit these moments of despair and I think, okay, you know what? Let's dismantle these systems and start again. Let's start afresh. And I will often call one of my thought partners and say, okay, we're starting a new university. How are we going to fund it? How are we going to govern? Should we charge tuition? Should it be inquiry-based? Should we have a big burning question and then build the whole, like, I will do the whole fantasy escapism, but I've realized in the last 2 years that it is lazy and unnuanced unless I enact the change I want to see. And unless I start to challenge not the people, but the systems and the structures and the policies that are being reproduced without us making them visible and then dismantling them. So I think that Hope University is not bricks and mortar. It's not a location. It is a mindset, and it is a way of being that is inspired by Ubuntu. It is inspired by leaders like you who are asking us to think differently and to see differently in our 21st century context, not just as a thought experiment, but as a fundamental calling of how we live our integrity to make this world better. So that's a resounding yes. And, you know, Pat
and as one of those thought partners who gets dragged into these things all the time, I think that's a resounding yes, but I would add one more step further. We can think about it and we can talk about it all we want, but until we truly act it, until we action this stuff, it's still just sitting there in the ether. And I think we're seeing some of this action now as a result of all of the conversation around equity, diversity, and inclusion in Canada, in my opinion, has never been louder or stronger. The call for tearing down the university system in order to build it up using Indigenous ways of knowing has never been stronger. We had a global pandemic, and we learned that everything is interconnected, and we can't just do like our little nice Canadian box over here that doesn't interact with Brazil and doesn't interact with the Ukraine and whatnot. So I think the time is now for whatever Hope University is. We just need to get to the action phase and really, you know, punch it in the guts, give it a beating.
And do it in communion with the other, right? Paulo Freire says that hope doesn't happen in isolation. It has to happen in communion with the other. And so in this journey, inviting you as a guide, in communion with you, in understanding the ways in which we're totally integrated, that we cannot be ourselves without each other, is so powerful. And you are my number one in this project, in this set of conversations. And I hope that when we share this with others, that they find the insight and the wisdom and the guidance that you have provided today, and do some reflection on how to anchor it in their own practice, in their own day-to-day lives, not just in the big actions, but in the everyday of holding their metaphorical bicycle over their heads and saying politely, please excuse me as we carry on with this vocation that is inherently hopeful. Thank you, Joy. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Pat, as my co-host. Thank you for participating in what will be an ongoing conversation as we think about the ways we can build in and make visible the narratives of failure, of vulnerability, and of critical hope.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this.
Thank you so much, Joy.
Thank you.
Amazing.
And we're out.
And we're out. Stop recording.
And scene.